Uh, Good evening. With your permission, we're going to start mercifully on time. My name is Abbas Milani. I direct the Iranian Studies program here. And before I introduce our esteemed guest tonight, I want to make a couple of announcements. If you have seen this sheet, this has one of our remaining events that happens on June 11th. Shahriyar Mandanipur, a great writer, fiction writer, and literary critic, will be reading some of his recent works. The event will be in English. We have two other events that are not on this page, and I would like to announce it now. The two events are tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. This is a rather busy week for Iranian studies. Tomorrow, we have a talk by Mr. Amjad, who is a prominent Iranian playwright, historian of the theater, and critic. I've been reading some of his work. It's truly a remarkably rich number of both critical writings as well as plays. He will be talking about modernity and the theater in Iran. It is tomorrow at 6:30 at Annenberg Auditorium in the Art Building. The day after tomorrow, Saturday at 6:30, the Darvak group will be performing one of Mr. Amjad's play called Negin. Both of these events are in Persian. And Mr. Amjad, as well as Mr. Ehya, who has directed the play, will be there to answer questions after the performance. The performance is 1 hour. It again is at Annenberg, and it is at 6:30 on Saturday. So tomorrow, modernity and Persian theater. Saturday, one of these Persian theaters called Negin. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest tonight, easily one of the most accomplished Iranian journalists working in the West. She has a long, acclaimed career that began in 1992 in New York Times and ended in 2009 when she was virtually forced out of Iran because she dared speak the truth, I think. I think the Iranian regime, if you read her memoir, which is truly a wonderfully wrought account of her life, of her journey as a journalist, and of the Iranian society as it is going through these travails, the 1979 revolution and the 2009 revolution. We have copies of the book available. She has agreed to kindly sign them if you get a copy. There are not too many copies, so I strongly recommend it. It is truly engrossing and informative and informed, and it tells you, if you read it, why she was essentially forced out of Iran. The regime, I think, if you read the memoir, made 3 mistakes about her. They thought that because she's a woman, they can push her around. They were wrong. They thought that because she is an Iranian woman, journalist, they can push her around and intimidate her. They were wrong. And they thought that because she has one of the plumbest jobs in journalism, a New York Times correspondent in Tehran writing about Iran, they would use a combination of inducements and threats to force her to pull her punches, as many journalists who write from Iran do, in order to keep that plum job. I understand it, but some decide not to do that, and she is one of those people. And I think everyone owes her a great deal, because in her writing she not only spoke the truth, but she also began covering Iran in a way that was very different than just writing about the nuclear issue or writing about the politics at the center of power. She began to write about cultural events. She gave essentially the world the first window into the subaltern cultural life that has been thriving in Iran. We know of Namju to no small measure because of her reporting. So it gives me great pleasure and personal delight and honor to introduce to you our esteemed guest tonight, Ms. Nazila Fathi.
Dr. Milani, thank you so much. That was a very kind introduction. I don't know if I deserve it. It's my personal delight to be here. And thank you very much for everything you have done, not only for Iranians, but also for Iranian studies. And for the way a lot of Iranians have come to you and you have provided refuge for them. So a lot of us are grateful to you. Thank you so much for coming here. I don't want to tell you about the stories that are already in the book and you can read them. I want to tell you about why I wrote the book, what led me to write the stories that I think are important about Iran, stories that are not just about my life. I have tried to pick stories that were part of the experience of a larger group of Iranians, those Iranians who stayed behind, lived through the war, lived through the years of the Islamic Republic, the first 10 years under Khomeini, which were quite brutal and hard years. And then the years that came later on, I like to think that there were 3 decades after the revolution, after the 1979 revolution. The first decade during the war, and when Khomeini was alive, the second era when it was under Rafsanjani, and sort of the new leaders tried to change some of the policies that they had initiated in the early years after the revolution. And the third decade, when Khatami came to power, and it was known as the reform years. And I think all along, life became easier, things changed. But I didn't write the book to tell the stories that you already know. I wrote the book to talk about some of the stereotypes that the Islamic Republic wanted to project of Iran and of Iranians. And in 2009, when I left Iran and I started giving talks, I was very surprised that a lot of those stereotypes were ideas and notions that people believed about Iran. Stereotypes that we had fought against during our years in Iran. We had tried not to be the walking symbols, not to accept those stereotypes. But outside Iran, those ideas had become accepted ideas. In 2005, before the presidential election that led to Ahmadinejad's election, I went to see a reformist editor. And I had gone to see him to find out if the reformers, supporters of Khatami, had a viable candidate in mind. Because Khatami had served his 8 years as president, and the survival of the sort of reform movement and the promise to change the hardline system depended on if they had a good candidate. I spoke to this editor. I got a sense that they didn't have a good candidate in mind, which turned out to be true, and that was why Ahmadinejad got elected. But after I finished my interview, I had learned to put away my notebook and my pen and just to linger for another cup of tea. In Tehran, they serve tea, not coffee. Just for a conversation, because I'd learned that it was during those times when I was not taking notes that these people usually spoke their mind. I don't know what he said, but he referred to the Shah and Reza Shah, and I just dismissed them as dictators because I had gone to school under the Islamic Republic. This is what I was taught. This is what everybody talked about in public, and this was the government line that I was supposed to say in a public place. But I was shocked when he got angry and he snapped at me. And he said to me that I didn't know my history. Now, I mean, I had heard this from a lot of ordinary people. I had learned it from my parents, a lot of people who had been disillusioned with the revolution. And in fact, when I had just started my journalism job in the early 1990s, one of my assignments was to go to bookstores to find out what books were selling well. And all the bookstores were telling me that books about the royal family were selling like crazy. They were the most popular books. Now, this didn't mean that people wanted the Shah's son to return or they wanted monarchy to come back to Iran, but it was a sense of nostalgia for something that a lot of people had lost after the revolution. And but I was completely shocked to hear the same language from this editor, because this editor had been one of the staunch supporters of the revolution. He had been very close to Khomeini. And in the early days of the revolution, he had been the head of a so-called comité in those early days, when they had set up these militia forces to go on the streets and round up people who were against Khomeini, who opposed his Islamic Republic. And a lot of those people had landed in prison, and a lot of them had been executed. So I was surprised to hear these words from someone who had made those sacrifices. He had also fought in the war with Iraq and was a member of the Revolutionary Guards in those days. Then he said something that made total sense to me. He said, we fought for political freedom, but what happened after the revolution, we also lost our personal freedoms. Now, this was something that, as an 8-year-old during the 1979 revolution, made sense to me too, because at that time when the revolution happened, everybody thought that all the changes would be political. But for me as a little girl, a lot of things started changing about my life. I had to wear a headscarf and go to school. And what hurt me most of all was that we lived in a housing complex where we had a swimming pool. And that pool was the center of life for us. We swam in the pool in the summertime, in the wintertime. We took our skis in the pool and just slid down the slope. But suddenly we were banned from that pool. And boys my age could swim there while we had to wear a headscarf and a thick nylon coat and sit around the pool. So I had sensed that loss of personal freedom from a very early age, and I could see how this guy who had made sacrifices, he had lost his brother in the war, he would feel completely disillusioned and disappointed in the revolution. Now, the book is not just about how many of these hardliners, many of these people who were willing to do anything in the early days of the revolution, how they have evolved, but also about many notions about Iranian people and also about Iranian women. In the past 35 years, the Islamic Republic has been extremely brutal, extremely repressive. They have taken the country probably 100 years back in many ways. The war was completely devastating, and now the country's ambitions over having a nuclear program has also been very devastating for the economy. Some analysts have compared the losses to the Iranian economy similar to what happened during the war, because the sanctions have hurt the Iranian economy in ways that it has deprived its infrastructure from major development, the oil and gas industry from major development, and so it has suffered hugely. But some of the Islamic Republic policies have changed to inadvertent changes in Iranian society in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the revolution, and especially about women. When the Islamic regime came to power, Khomeini knew that he could not rely on the middle class, on the upper class for support. He knew that if they had opposed the Shah, they had not been Islamists, they had been socialists. They had belonged to one of the leftist groups, and they were quite disillusioned with the Islamic system that he created. So very quickly he started marginalizing a lot of these people, rounding them up, and even eliminating them from the civil sector. Instead, they started relying on people from the villages, from the margins of society. And they hired a lot of these people to assume jobs that had previously belonged to people who were educated, they had the expertise, but at the time of the revolution, expertise didn't matter anymore. It was their ideological support that mattered more. And as the war broke out, Khomeini started relying on their wives to take a lot of these responsibilities in society. When I was growing up, when I went to elementary school, there were all these women who came to our schools, and they called themselves morality teachers. They came to our schools to sort of invite us, accept Khomeini's ideology, to believe in those religious ideas that they wanted to tell the next generation believe in. And they wore the same clothes that supporters of Khomeini wore. They didn't wear the traditional chador that my grandmother had worn. These women wore a hood over their heads, long, loose coats, and dark pants, and over all those layers, they wore the chador. The way my grandmother had worn the chador was in a very simple way. Sometimes slipped over her head and fell over her shoulders and showed her hair. But the chador, the Islamic dress, had a totally different meaning after the revolution. And we had to wear those clothes, and we had to wear it exactly the same way that they wanted us to wear it. In other words, we had to become the walking symbols of the Islamic Republic, and we hated it. We didn't want to accept the homogeny that the regime wanted to impose on us. So we didn't believe what these morality teachers were telling us. And one reason for it was because we didn't understand their language. We didn't like the way they spoke Persian. They didn't speak the beautiful Persian language that we had heard we should speak. These women came from villages. They spoke Persian with an accent, and they kept on warning us about things that was clear they had no idea what they were. For example, there was one of them who always warned us about the dangers of Walkman. Now, in those days, we had to use Walkman to listen to music secretly at school, but this woman had no idea what it was, and she kept on referring to it as Walkman. But the funny thing is that Walkman has a meaning in Persian. It means original packaging. So there was no way that we would listen to her. What happened was that in the 1990s, when I was in the 1980s, when I was in high school, it was these women who started to change. When they had come to our school in the early days, they had brought down all the mirrors because they thought it was too vain for us to look at ourselves in the mirrors. In the 80s, they started wearing braces on their teeth, contact lenses instead of glasses to beautify themselves. And in the 1990s, when I started working as a journalist, they became what we call them, Islamist feminists. Now, in those days, we couldn't call them Islamists in their face because they would go red and purple and say that feminism was a Western notion. What they were doing was rooted in the Persian and Islamic culture. But by the late 1990s, they started calling themselves a feminist as well. But they were right. What they were doing was really rooted in the indigenous culture. They began going to the homes of senior clerics in the city of Qom, which is like the Vatican of Shiite Islam in Iran, knocked on the cleric's door and started asking them to reinterpret the laws. After the revolution, the Islamists had replaced the secular legal system of the Shah with the Islamic law, with the Sharia. And so the civil code and the penal code were all based on Sharia, which said the life of a woman was worth the value of a man's life. Her testimony in court was worth half the testimony of a man. That meant two women had to testify so that their testimony would be equal to the testimony of a man. And many, many other discriminations against women. Now, these women started going to these clerics and asked them to change the laws. They said these laws were written for the time of Prophet Muhammad, 1400 years ago. Women were more educated, they were working, they were contributing to their household economies, so they had to enjoy equal rights with their husbands. And the reason for that was that these women had started to suffer the brutality of Islamic law with their own flesh and blood. A lot of these women had relied on their steady incomes as government employees. They had moved up in society. They had joined the middle class. Some of them, their husbands were fighting in the war. If the husbands died in the war, they realized that they couldn't keep their children according to Islamic law. Their children belonged to the paternal grandfather, so they were coming and taking their children away. If their husbands were coming back and they were in unhappy marriages, they couldn't get divorced. But according to the law, a man could divorce his wife whenever he wished. And the wives couldn't get the custody of their children. They had to leave their house without any rights. So they had suffered those brutal laws in every possible way. And they really believed that those laws had to change. By 2000, more than half of university students have been women. Last year, in 2014, according to numbers released by the regime, at a lot of universities, more than 70% of the students were women. These numbers are very similar to the numbers here in the United States, and they show that Iranian women have become empowered by education. A lot of them have joined the middle class, and they have become a force of change because they are extremely angry at the way they are treated at home and in society. At home, partly because of a lot of cultural traditions that are quite chauvinistic, and because of the laws that discriminate against them. And in 2009, during the uprising, if you remember, there were lots of pictures that were taken of the protesters on the streets where women were at the forefront. There were a lot of videos that showed men were following women were leading the protest, or women were even throwing themselves between young men who were being beaten up by vigilante forces. They were willing to take the beatings, but to stop somehow the violence. So yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions about Iran. When my book was coming out, they showed me the picture that is now on the cover of the book. And when I saw the book, I was very disappointed. And I told my publisher that I didn't like it because I didn't think that the woman in the head-to-toe cover either represented me or any of the women that I had written about. Some of the writers, if they're lucky, they get 3 pictures and they can pick one of them. I was shown only this one, and my publisher said, you know what, this is it. We've done all our research. This is the picture that is going to sell the book. We've shown the picture to everyone and asked, if you want to buy a book about Iran, which photo are you going to choose? And everybody pointed to this one. Now, I've been very happy with my publisher. I think they made a very smart choice. But me, coming from my background and wanting to have probably a woman on the cover that showed tons of hair, was very different than the conceptions that people here in the West, even a lot of Iranians, have of Iranian women. We had to wear layers and layers of black in the early days of the revolution. If you visit Iran now, women are wearing anything except layers and layers of black. They do wear the headscarf. That is still the law, but I've always wondered how they keep the headscarf back here on the top of their hair and it doesn't slip down. So women have been fighting. They have been pushing back the boundaries. And they have definitely changed a lot of laws. When I was in Iran 5 years ago, it was still a problem to have a concert, to have a music concert, but it was becoming possible. Musicians could go and get permits and have private concerts. But now there are tons of videos on the web, and there are bands performing on the street. This might not sound like a huge change, but for Iranians it is. I mean, it's been these step-by-step changes that has allowed them to create a bigger space for a lot of Iranians. In 2009, when I left Iran, a lot of people asked me what happened, that the green movement failed, that Iranians had to withdraw from the streets and they were not able to overthrow the regime. Now, that was a surprising question to me, because I never thought that in 2009 people had come out on the streets to overthrow the regime. I had been very surprised that they had continued protesting for 6 months. I didn't think Iranian people were in any kind of mindset to stay out on the streets, get killed, be willing to initiate a kind of bloodshed to bring about change. And I had learned this lesson years before, in '99, when the first anti-regime protests broke out. Back then, the students led the first anti-regime protests all around the country through their student networks. They mobilized people. Thousands of people came out for a week, and they protested. What happened was, after a week, the government came out with an iron fist. They cracked down the protest, arrested all the student leaders and activists, jailed them, and put an end to the demonstrations. A year after those events, I met a student leader who had been in prison, had been tortured, had been held in solitary confinement, but he'd come out and resumed activism. I was meeting him with a colleague who had covered Iran for a long time, and she had covered the revolution, and so knew Iran quite well. During our interview, she turned around and asked the student leader if he was willing to die for freedom. The student leader looked quite surprised, and then he said, no, I'm fighting for freedom. I have no intention of dying, and I want to live and have a better life. When we walked out, my colleague told me that she was very disappointed in the student movement, and she didn't think that this student movement would be able to bring about change because its leaders were not willing to die for freedom. She said that had been the reason in 1979 that the revolutionaries succeeded, because so many of them were willing to become martyrs. And this had been true during the American Revolution and the French Revolutions. I was quite intrigued by this analysis. So I started asking people. I started asking activists, leaders, journalists who were even activists, whether any of them were willing to die for democracy. And not a single one of them ever told me that they were willing to die. So in 2009, when Neda Sultan was killed, the woman who died during the protests, and a video of her death went viral, my editor called me and asked me if I could write a story about the protesters and their willingness to become martyr and Neda's martyrdom. I was quite surprised, and I explained to her that, hey, listen, this generation of Iranians have nothing to do with martyrdom. It's nothing that they're seeking. This is just an idea. I've never come across anyone who's willing to become a martyr. This is all government propaganda. So I ended up writing a story about Neda, true story, who she was, just an ordinary young woman, frustrated with the restrictions on her life. She'd become emotional, had come out on the streets. She had never been part of any political movement or organizations, and quite sad and bad luck, she was shocked on the street. And she was named as a martyr. That was the interesting thing, that a political leader started calling a woman a martyr for the first time. But this woman had not come out to sacrifice her life or had any desire to become a part of that martyrdom cult, if it ever existed. So I knew in 2009 that Iranians were extremely frustrated, extremely angry at the Islamic Republic. Nobody loves this regime. Nobody likes it. Even those who support it, they support it for other reasons. This is an extremely repressive regime. But Iranians are not in a state that they would come out and engage in any kind of activity like the ones in Egypt or Tunisia that would lead to any kind of institutional breakdown. And the reason for that is because the majority of the population, 70%, were born after the revolution. A lot of them, they know about the bloodshed after the revolution, about the war. And you ask people tell you that it was during the institutional breakdown of 1979, during the time of instability, that Khomeini managed to hijack the situation. Because everybody knows that Khomeini was not the only leader that toppled the Shah. There were so many other groups. And he didn't have the intellectuals and the educated class behind him. So Iranians are scared that if there is any kind of instability, again, hardliners would hijack the situation and they wouldn't be able to move forward with their agenda for democracy. And the second reason for that is because Iranian demographic has changed profoundly in the past 35 years. The majority of people live in the cities now, over 70%. The middle class has grown dramatically, partly because of government policies. The fact that the regime increased the size of the civil sector, put a lot of people, especially from rural areas, on steady incomes, and they started moving up the economic ladder. And a third, because of education levels, especially among women. I mean, you are faced with a population where women are increasingly more educated than men in the past 15 years, since early 2000. And if you want to change a society, change its women. Women raise the next generation. And they tend to want to avoid violence a lot more than men. When in 2009, I wanted to go to downtown Tehran to cover the protest, I had a hard time finding a driver who was willing to drive me downtown where the protests were taking place. Most of these drivers were coming from poor neighborhoods to work in more affluent neighborhoods in northern Tehran. But they complained to me that they were afraid that if they drove to the areas where there were demonstrations, they were afraid that a rock would get hurled at their car and their car would get dented. So if people are not willing to get their car dented, you know that they're definitely not willing to get themselves hurt in any way. So I don't think Iranians would engage in any kind of activism that would lead to overthrowing the regime. They're definitely waiting for the system to either crumble down from within, or, as you see, they have chosen the path of going to the polls, even if it is every 4 years, to bring about very slow but gradual change. In 2013, when they went back to the polls to elect Rouhani, they went with very little hope. In 2009, their votes had been stolen, so they were almost certain that the same thing is going to happen. And besides, Rouhani was not such a moderate. He was not the liberal candidate that a lot of people wanted to see as their president. But they went to the polls to send a message to the regime. Iranians have learned to send signals to the regime, and even though the regime does not respond to those signals, but it turned out that in 2013, it does hear these signals and it does understand them. And surprisingly, they allowed Rouhani to get elected. And he's been moving forward with one of his major campaign promises to end the economic sanctions and seek rapprochement with the West and put an end to the nuclear standoff. Now, I'm going to end with a note on the nuclear talks. I hope there's an agreement because of Iranian civil society. I don't think that things are going to change in their favor if there is a nuclear deal. But first of all, if there is an agreement, people's economic situation will start to improve. It is not the government that is under economic pressure. It is ordinary Iranians that are suffering the sanctions. The regime has access to oil revenue, to its oil. It's been smuggling it, selling it, has enough cash, has enough revenue to sustain itself. It's the ordinary Iranian that has been suffering. And secondly, it's a way to strengthen the moderates in Iran. Iran has been divided between the moderates and hardliners for many, many years. And every time that Iranians have had a chance, they have sided with the moderates. That's the only option that they have. If the moderates manage to reach an agreement with the West, they will get an upper hand in Iranian politics. And in the meantime, if they are the ones that the West is engaging with, the West can demand more accountability from them, can demand from them to craft policies that are more responsive to the international community. And this way, Iranian waters will get stronger in Iran and move toward policies that would, in some ways, respond to Iranian people's democratic needs. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. You gave me a great deal of hope for that country. And unfortunately, that is not often seen in American press. However, with respect to your own wishes, what kind of changes would you like to see happen in Iran more rapidly?
Well, the first thing that I'd like to see is to get to see a lot of prisoners released, a lot of political prisoners released. Actually, in the past 5 years, a lot of positive change has taken place on a social level. When you talk to people, they say that they have a lot more freedom. I mean, just last year, for the very, very first time ever in the history of the Islamic Republic, somebody stood up, Rouhani stood up and stopped the militia forces that they've had different names since the revolution. Now they call themselves Basij, sometimes they were called Komite, different names. He stopped them from starting their campaign, their usual summer campaign to crack down against women's dress. That was the first time ever. So those kinds of social changes have already happened. But on a political level, the regime has been very oppressive. There are many, many young people, a lot of them who just turned to journalism because they wanted to express their political ideas. A lot of Iranian journalists who work for local media, they are activists. They use the media as a platform to write about their ideas. A lot of them are in prison. And I like to see a lot of these young people out, able to write. And I think that's one of the first things that, if we see, would be a sign that things are moving in a good direction. But unfortunately, I think one of the first things that the hardliners are going to do, if there isn't a clear agreement, they're going to crack down on these people. They're going to keep them in prison longer because they're afraid that because they have lost on one front, they're going to lose on another front at home too. So they would try to flex their muscles at home and show that they still can hold the leash on society.
What is your working relationship with Thomas Erten? He's with New York Times, right?
He's my successor. He was a very good friend, but he's my successor now. I don't work with him.
Oh, you don't work with New York Times?
Not anymore. I had Thomas's job. After I left, Thomas took my job.
In your opinion, why isn't he getting kicked out of Iran?
Well, I was in Iran for a long time. And I think people were asking the same question about me too. Why isn't she getting kicked out? There were others who were getting kicked out. I think the Islamic Republic tolerates people for a while. And then the other reason I think is that the government or the hardliners look at people as potential hostages. I was an Iranian Canadian. Apparently Iranian Canadians, Iranian Americans make good hostages. And a Dutch doesn't make a good hostage, I think. Fortunately for him. Yes.
That's sort of related to what I was wondering. When you got kicked out of Iran, I was surprised you weren't put in jail.
I wasn't kicked out. I left before.
You were able to leave.
Yeah.
Did you think you might be put in jail?
I was very concerned about my safety. In 2009, they banned journalists from covering the protests, but we kept on covering them. For me, they were the biggest stories of my life. I thought the demonstrations were even more important than the 1979 revolution because, first of all, they were the ones that I was seeing as a grown-up, as an adult, so they were more important to me. They were closer to my heart. And then the numbers were huge. Millions of people were just pouring out on the streets spontaneously. And it was a very emotional time, so I kept covering them. I received a phone call from a Basij commander who told me that my picture had been even given to snipers to shoot at me if they saw me on the street. I thought they were just intimidating me. But then one day I noticed that my house had come under surveillance. And since that day, I never left my home. I didn't leave my home until the night that I had tickets to leave the country. I had planned a vacation in Canada from months ago, and we were just very lucky to have those tickets. We went to the airport after midnight when the forces had left, and we haven't been back yet. Yes?
I have a question which is somehow related to the question Sherman asked. So, the way I understood it, you cast an image of years that the women's rights actually have been limited, like in family control, or as you can say, in multiple marriages for men, and also limitations on university entrance for girls. So how these two images are going to reconcile the factual image versus the story that I understood?
Well, you know, what I said was that Iranian society and Iranian women have changed. I never said that the laws have changed. The laws are, unfortunately, as backward as they can be. Very little, almost no change, no improvement has been made. I don't think the change that was even made to the laws is nearly what Iranian women want. There were some very tiny changes in early 2000 about custody laws and divorce rights, but no, there has been no changes. I think that's the problem, that Iranian society altogether is a lot more ahead of the Iranian legal and political system. So if there is change, this society has the capacity to accept it. But Iranian society did not have the capacity to accept the kind of changes that the Shah wanted to introduce before the revolution. The Shah wanted to educate women, but the majority of the population lived in the villages. They were very traditional. They were very religious. If you went to a religious family in a village and asked them to send their daughters to the city to go to university, they wouldn't have allowed their daughters to go to university. What happened after the revolution was that Khomeini segregated everywhere. Government buildings, schools, even the buses were segregated later on, public buses. So a lot of these people, first of all, felt that they were sending their daughters into a society that was completely segregated, into an Islamic society, and then Khomeini also made a direct call to them. He said that Islam needed their daughters. Islam needed their women to serve it, to serve the revolution. So they thought they were doing a service by sending their daughters and their wives to universities, to schools, and that's what led to a profound change. As these women came into society, they moved up in society, they became educated. I think it's these women who are the force of change now. And a lot of them are the mothers of a lot of these young activists that you see on the streets. They have already raised a generation that they have very different aspirations than the generation of people during the 1979 revolution. Yes?
In your opinion, your thoughts, first of all, thank you for your talk. It's been very informative. How do you see what role Iranian Americans, Iranian Canadians, Iranian diaspora can play to support the moderate people and moderate folks in Iran? There's a lot of talk shows, there's a lot of talk radio, but most of that seems to be just for self-grandizing. But what can ordinary people do here?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and many people ask me, and there's clearly a very strong desire on the side of Iranian diaspora to support Iranian people. And I think the most important thing is to support what they want. I mean, a lot of times I heard from Iranians inside the country, they said that Iranians outside the country don't understand what we want. They think we are capable of creating a kind of change that requires a lot of sacrifice, and they expect us to do that, to take those risks. And besides, that's not what they want to see. I mean, they want to see gradual change, a kind of change that is going to be steady and long-lasting. So I think it is important to understand what they want and support what they want. And I think that one of the most beautiful things that happened in 2009, all those protests, all those demonstrations that took place outside the country everywhere, it was a show of support for what Iranians want inside the country. And Iranians were not making any kind of demand here. So I think it is important to understand what they want and how they want to bring about change. Even though a lot of us are quite frustrated here with the speed of change in Iran, a lot of people have been waiting. I remember When I was banned from swimming in our pool, my parents promised me every year that this would be the last year that the clerics are in power, that they're going to leave and we would be able to swim. Here I am. I've never been able to swim in that pool. The reality of life is that the Islamic Republic has been in power, its foundations are quite solid, and it's not going to go anywhere. So we have to accept that reality and see how change can be brought about. Yes?
I got the impression during the demonstrations that were going on in 2009 that many of them thought that the U.S. was going to come and support them. And was there a lot of disappointment when that didn't happen? Because we supported what was going on in Egypt, and here we were leaving Iran high and dry for the Green Party.
I think you're right. A lot of people were disappointed that there was not more vocal support for what Iranians were doing. And I know that the Obama administration was very hesitant to support the protests because the Iranian regime was already claiming that they were instigated by the West and they didn't have any kind of sort of indigenous root or reasons inside the country. But, you know, I think at that time that was sort of was a reason that people were very, very desperate to be able to win that small battle. And when they sort of failed, and what they wanted was just new elections. They felt they were cheated from the minimum right that they had been given to go to the polls and elect one of the candidates that had already been approved by the regime. And when they felt that they had lost that battle, they felt that perhaps they had been betrayed by the United States. But I don't know how. I don't see how the United States would have been able to help them on that front. Yes.
I think you are concerned about, and you mentioned about the political prisoners in Iran right now, which their number are growing actually, and rightfully so. But I take you back to the time of the Shah. There were also political prisoners at that time. Most of those political prisoners today are part of the power structure in Iran, as well as the others like the Mujahideen and the communists and the Fadaiyan who were in prison and they were released after the revolution, and then they behaved quite erratically. Many ways, if you look at the history of after the revolution, immediately the first 1 or 2 years. I was there. I was witnessing all that change and what was going on. The thing is, in my opinion, rather than worry about the political prisoners or, for example, the people, the guerrilla revolution, Mousavi and Karoubi, both of them they were part of this political and power structure of today, but somehow they had conflicts with each other. So people should not be really talking about why Mustafa was not elected. It wouldn't make a damn difference if he was elected or not. The thing, of course, is about their votes, and they had the right to protest for them. My point is that it's better have a positive engagement with Iran from the West and gradually change this regime so the middle class that you mentioned is growing. That's a good news. Will grow more educated classes. Women participate in the society. That is what eventually will change Iran. Iran has had 4 revolutions during the last 100 years. None of them has bear any fruit. If you look at the history of Iran, the first revolution, the Mossadegh time, the Khomeini time, and all of that, none of them has resulted in anything, because this democracy that we are talking about is not what is part of and parcel of the Iranian society or the Middle East for that matter. So my thing is, what do you think about a more positive engagement rather than this kind of, they should do this, they should do that, they should change, they should democratize and stuff like that.
Well, thank you so much for your concern. I think that what you said is exactly what the Western negotiators think as well. So they are negotiating with Iran without raising the issue of human rights violation. And so from a diplomatic perspective, that is probably the way to move forward. And you're right, you're absolutely right. But the question was, what do I like to see? And I used to see a lot of these people. A lot of them were my sources. They helped me do the job that I did for many, many years. And it's very hard to know that they have been in prison under very, very tough conditions for years and years now, since 2009. Mousavi and Karoubi, you're absolutely right. That's part of an internal fight. However, I think they should be allowed to talk, and I am glad that they haven't suddenly disappeared. I'm glad that a lot of these people are still in prison and they haven't been executed the way the regime dealt with its opposition for many years. For almost a decade, whoever opposed the regime suddenly disappeared in prison. So that is change, and I agree with you that positive engagement is more important than going after political prisoners' release.
I mean, I want them out as much as everybody does. I mean, but the thing is, we have seen this scenario played so many times, and the new guys that come out and that they get the power, they're always worse than the previous ones. So this is the story about that.
I was wondering, as a journalist, if you could talk a little bit about the impact of social media and technology in Iran in recent years, both about the positive and also the shortcomings.
The shortcomings?
Yeah.
Well, I never look at any of the shortcomings. I think the social media, not only social media, what I call the connecting media, connecting tools that starts with mobile phones, satellite TV, and the internet, whatever comes along with the internet. I think it has empowered Iranian society in ways that wouldn't have been possible. And the mobile phones and satellite TV came to Iran very early on, much earlier than any other country in the region. And also the internet. The internet came to Iran in the early 90s, and it was the fastest growing in Iran than any other region. And people started using them as a platform to express political opinion. And this was very important. I mean, when people discuss things, they start brainstorming. It takes them away from actions that are more violent, and then it allows them to discuss things that they cannot discuss without those tools. For instance, if I think Iranians had internet in 1979, they would have learned about Khomeini's agenda for ruling. Somebody would have brought up the issue that he had written a book and had clearly stated his idea about how he wanted to rule Iran. I mean, look at Montazeri, when the internet made it possible for him, he published his memoir, and it was then that for the first time somebody acknowledged Khomeini had killed some 4,000 prisoners. So I think it's been the most empowering tool, not for Iranians, but also for many other countries in the region. Yes.
Most news indicates that there is about 5 to maybe 15% of the Iranian population are staunch supporter of the current regime. With your experience, and what do you think about that number, and how do you also see which part of this sort of a reformist group might have a better chance of changing for the better within that, with the existing regime?
No, that is a very interesting question, and there are different answers to it. I don't know how you can draw a line where you can, who is a regime supporter and what it means. I think when Khomeini was alive, that was a lot more easier because during the first decade of the revolution, supporters of the revolution were ideological. Many of them came from very, very poor neighborhoods, from poor areas, and they were willing to do anything for Khomeini. They saw him as their spiritual leader. But that has not been the case with Khamenei. First of all, Khamenei he never had the same kind of religious rank that Khomeini had, and he never focused on the class that Khomeini had. try to draw. I mean, Khomeini always talked about mustazafin. He wanted to empower them, mustazafin meaning the deprived, the poor, and he did. He did improve their lives. But when Khomeini came to power, he began relying on the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij. He started giving them more power, and instead of relying on the masses that Khomeini had relied on, he started relying on the militia forces and the Revolutionary Guards. So the support base has definitely changed. But what is true is that as people started moving up the economic ladder before the revolution and started losing faith in the establishment, the same thing has been happening among Khamenei's supporters now. I mean, I came across a lot of Basij members in the 90s, in the early 2000s, that they joined the Basij believing that Khamenei was their leader, that whatever he said, they had to do. And they all changed. They all changed very quickly. I mean, I would say that it took them a shorter time to change than it had taken people in the early years to change, because, I mean, part of it might have been satellite TV and the internet. I mean, I knew one of them who surfed the web every day. I mean, he spends more time reading news on the web as much as I did. And this guy changed in 2000 and when was it? 2005. He was still a member of the Basij. His commander had told him to vote for Ahmadinejad, and he went and voted for Rafsanjani. So the regime has been losing its supporters, not only those who are becoming disillusioned, but more so among those who are moving up in society and lose their faith. But the thing is that a lot of these people, especially senior Revolutionary Guards commanders, are quite dependent on the status quo. They don't want any change. They have great economic interests. They don't want to see any kind of change. So you can count on them, even though they don't support the ideology, the system. They know how corrupt it is, but they don't want to see any change. So those people would be very defensive if there are any protests, demonstrations. A lot of those people come out and try to avoid change. Yes?
So a central theme of your talk appears to me that it is that the Iranian society is further ahead. It has progressed far beyond the limitations that the government imposes upon it, correct?
Absolutely.
And that sort of distance that's being created between the reins of power and where society is advanced to is somehow going to lead to change in a fundamental way. So that's one hypothesis. The other one, I think somebody in their talks mentioned, I think you concurred, that there's enough dissent within the regime. There's quarrels that are ongoing all the time. So my question for you is, given that so many other examples of uprisings, whether it was in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, that it was successful, and people had to pay a price. Which one of these two scenarios do you believe ultimately will result in a change? And again, this is probably looking into a crystal ball. Will it happen in my lifetime?
Well, it is definitely looking into a crystal ball. I don't think anyone had foreseen what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. A lot of people knew there was dissent, that people were unhappy. But whether people were able to overthrow Mubarak in a couple of weeks, I don't think anyone had seen that. I don't want to make any predictions about Iran's situation, but from what I have seen, from my interviews, from my close observation, Iranian society has moved away from any kind of action that entails any kind of instability. They are afraid of it. I mean, nobody wants to see bloodshed. Nobody wants to see mass arrests anymore. People were intimidated, very intimidated by what happened in 2009. thousands of people were rounded up, and they were not just sitting in a cell in prison. Those who were released were totally different people. They had been tortured, they had been raped. A lot of them don't even speak about what has happened to them. And, they've become examples for people. Nobody wants to follow that path. And a lot of people would even tell you what happened in 2009 was a mistake. We were carried away. Even though at that time they defended it, I personally think it was the most important historic event of our recent history. That it happened because society had reached a point that it exploded, that dissent had reached a point that people just spontaneously poured out on the streets. I personally, the way I see this gradual change going, the way that people even within the regime are unhappy with the situation, is that this system is gradually crumbling from within. I mean, you have Khamenei who was talking about animosity with the United States, referring to the United States as dushman, as the enemy, until last year this time. And then suddenly his tone became moderate. And this had been his tone since he took power in 1989. And he started restraining his supporters not to oppose the nuclear deal. I think the Islamic Republic, more than anything else, more than being ideological, revolutionary or anything, is a pragmatist. What matters for the Islamic Republic and Khamenei himself, and he has said this in his public speeches many, many times, is the survival of the Islamic Republic. Now, what does this survival mean? That's a different question. I mean, I personally think that the regime was founded on three major pillars in 1979. Animosity toward America, that's where the Death America slogan comes from. Animosity toward Israel, because Khomeini wanted to become the leader of all Muslims. He thought he could galvanize them by being hostile toward Israel. And the women became representatives of the Islamic Republic. Women's dress. The regime has clearly failed on imposing its homogeny on women. If there is some kind of nuclear agreement, it's not exactly rapprochement with the United States, but it's the first major rapprochement that Iran has had with the United States. Two of the pillars are gone, and I don't think a system can survive on one pillar. So a lot of its major principles would disappear, but I mean it would shed practically its facade. But what would happen within? That's the question. Does that mean Islamic Republic will become democratic? I'm not so sure, because it can become quite actually authoritarian inside the country. But if it wants to survive, it has to reform itself. Yes.
As an American voter, let's say, what would happen if our country just withdrew from that area? Would that be a second best approach to that area? And say, we shouldn't cause problems.
Well, I would put myself in Khamenei's shoes, the supreme leader's shoes, and I don't think that's what he wants to see, even though he wants to see the American presence in a different way, much different way. He definitely wants to see Iran as the regional player. He has exactly the same kind of ambitions for Iran that the Shah had. He wants Iran to be the superpower in the region.
So
but
that's all of the Middle East.
All the Middle East. I mean, as far as he can go. I mean, as far as Khamenei can.
Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc.
Well,
that's Iran.
No, that's not Iran. Iran wants to be the superpower in the region. It doesn't want to expand its influence in those countries.
Oh,
but it wants.
That's not.
Yeah, no. Okay. But don't forget that the United States helped rid Iran of all its major enemies in the region. I mean, Saddam was Iran's major enemy, and the United States toppled Saddam. The Taliban. Iran went almost into a war with the Taliban in 1999. The Taliban invaded Iran's consulate in Mazar Sharif. killed Iranian diplomats and journalists who were there. Iran dispatched troops to the border. I mean, both these regimes are gone now thanks to the United States. And I mean, after the fall of Saddam, Iran expanded its reach in the region. So the United States' presence in the region has not been so bad for Iran. Yes?
Yes, I had looked in the library database to see if you had written any previous books, not the label, but really written Japanese, and I came across a translation. I assume that was you, Shirin Ebedi's book. I wonder if you could talk a little about that project.
I translated that book before she won the Nobel Peace Prize. I thought back then that it was an amazing book because she had taken all the Iranian laws, the civil, the penal code, marriage laws, all the laws in the country, and compared them with the international conventions that Iran has signed. And so because Iran has signed those conventions, those laws should comply with those obligations, and a lot of them did not. So in that book, he reveals the contradictions. And along with that, he also discusses the International Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, which the Islamic countries got together and wrote to counter the International Convention of Human Rights. So that's the book. It's just a comparison of all the Islamic laws and Iran's obligations. Yes?
Going back to the Iranian society, what do you think about the narratives and the communications on the streets of Tehran or Iran altogether today? And has it had an influence on Basij or government police force per se, has had to marginalize these forces?
What is the question? I didn't get it.
The question is how much influence the dialogue in the society between the people has influenced the government forces to marginalize those government forces. In other words, when you walk on the street, people freely talk about Basij, they criticize it, they talk about Sepah al-Qadaf, freely, they shout across the street to one another. Does that mean that really the Sepah or the so-called forces are marginalized on the street? Or are they going away from the streets? Or people are no longer afraid of them?
Well, I think we've had that culture since the revolution. I never remember Iranians not criticizing the establishment or the forces linked to the establishment. I mean, I remember you got into a cab during some of the most repressive years, and people very openly criticized the regime, even in a line for bread. People expressed their anger. So I think that has been sort of the accepted culture. But whether this attitude has marginalized the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij, I am not sure. I don't think that's how they get their legitimacy, and that's not where, they definitely know they are unpopular. They know, I mean, a lot of them have told me that the way we are treated, when people find out that we are with the Basij, people treat us as though we are people from Mars, as though we don't belong to this society. They feel quite offended and insulted by that treatment. But I mean, Iranians have every right to treat them that way too, because they treat them quite inhumanely. Yes?
Can you say more about the relationship between Syria and the government of Iran, and what is all this that's happening within Syria?
Iran came out and supported Saddam. Iran used all its ability, technical, military ability to make sure that Assad would not lose power. It led to a civil war. And I think what that led was it helped ISIS to recruit members even better. Iran is fighting ISIS on one front, but I think the anger and the instability that Iran's support for Assad created indirectly helped ISIS to recruit better. I mean, there were all these stories in the early days after the Syrian uprising that members of the Revolutionary Guards were driving on the streets of Damascus using the same technology that they used in 2009 to find activists who were using the internet, uploading videos about the protests, and they were taking them away. They were nabbing them. They were shooting them. The Islamic Republic did everything that it could to help Assad stay in power, and that has led the biggest source of instability in the region. Partly because Assad was Iran's ally, and without Assad, Iran would lose one of its major arms in the Middle East. So I'm waiting for, I think our time is up. Thank you very much.